Well, welcome to our podcast edition, the Biz Help Changing Conversations podcast. Today, we're going to talk about all things sponsorship and the link between events and the tourism industry. And I'm very privileged today to have a very special guest all the way from New Zealand, Mr. Mike Keach from Impact Sponsorship, a sponsorship expert globally, has been recognized for a number of years. And Mike, I mean, we've known each other since what, 2012, 2013, when we first met. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Kia ora. And I will show a bit of my Australian as well, Sugen, and g'day to all the listeners. It actually feels a lifetime ago, Sugen, that we met. And
Yes.
Obviously I was privileged to keynote at the a conference in Johannesburg. And it's great to always stay connected, but be back talking today.
Well, great, Mike. Thanks so much for making the time to speak to us. I mean, with your experience in the industry, working with many big corporates, I mean, globally, you've been involved in a number of major events globally from a sponsorship perspective. Just give us a sense about your experience and some of the big brands that you've been working with and what it actually means for an industry like the events industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to sort of share some of those experiences. I actually think, Sugen, the thing I've learned over my time is that the same philosophy on a big partnership or sponsorship is actually the same principles as a local level, regional, national, or local partnership. We talked about that at Johannesburg with the conference, how you integrate and collaborate. And I think on brand side, I've been lucky enough to probably the pinnacle was I was blessed to be brought on board with DHL as part of their sponsorship team when we delivered the first sort of major investment into rugby in 2011, almost a worlds ago. To be part of a brand that was involved in New Zealand, most of the focus was pushing that and amplifying that out across Europe and other sort of markets. But big budgets, which is quite rare. The big events generally being enormous budgets, we're able to do a lot. But at the end of the day, the principles were the same, very clear objectives, understanding our market, and really importantly, integrating our brand into an event without the brand being the hero, because it's all about obviously rugby, the fans, and ultimately the level of engagement and storytelling you can do. So I was privileged to be in that team, had a great leader in Fiona Targ, and we were also involved in probably some of the discussions around what then sort of preluded, which was F1 sponsorships and a whole range of other things that DHL have now tinkered into, including gaming in the UK, so esports. So it definitely laid a really amazing portfolio for me and platform, but also gave me a real great insight to how things can be done at a top level. But at the same time, from my perspective, a huge kudos to a brand that is really led by strong culture. It's the people that made it amazing.
Yeah, and when we talk about people, I mean, when you talk about big events, the main thing that comes to mind is that, you get a lot of people that travel to these events. I mean, we've seen, particularly in South Africa, we have, when we had the British and Irish Rugby Lions Tour, for example, you had, over 50,000 fans that actually travel to these events. Now, these people that travel to these events, I'm sure in your experience, you would know this as well, they spend a lot of money in those destinations, right? And they help local economies to actually revive themselves. So is that your experience as well, working with?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Sugen. And I would also argue in its simplest form that whilst we are talking about sponsorship, I think there's that peripheral that people miss. It's the same, discussion that tourism for New Zealand is probably one of the top 3 GDP impacts, but ultimately education probably has more impact because the same as sport, the same as tourism, education, you immerse yourself as a student, you're bringing over money into the economy, your family invests in you, you're buying different things. It's a huge impact. And I think, without sort of doting on the negative, the thing that COVID and the impact of the pandemic globally did, I hope is really heightened the fact that, while sometimes we get caught up on the brand story and, the excitement of sport, the economic impact and the layers of impact that travels right through to the vendors, up to government, tourism, it's massive. And you can't underestimate the value that it has. Sales targets are great. But, I think with DHL, we had over the cycle of 48 matches for World Cup, we probably had about 4,000 people that visited New Zealand as part of DHL's investment. So it's there's a lot of people that benefited from the World Cup. And I'm sure, like yourself, you can see that at a micro level with small local events as well.
Yes. And, speaking about the pandemic, obviously the pandemic has a devastating impact on, particularly the tourism, the sports, and the event sector. I mean, we've seen that happening globally. But from last year, I don't know about you, but I've been seeing a hunger from people out there to get to stadiums. So once economies have been starting to open up, and as soon as lockdown regulations were relaxed, stadiums started getting full. I mean, we've seen the Euro 2020 games, for example, in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, those stadiums were full. We've seen what happened in Wimbledon this year. So would you say, when you talk about the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic had on the industry, particularly from a sponsorship perspective, do you think sponsors are starting to wait for economies to open up? Are they going to come back in a big way and support the events industry? What's your feeling?
No, I agree. I think to your first point, people are, we're human, we need connection. And I think we've got 2.5 years of build-up where people are just pining to get back to, that networking, the connection piece, being in front of someone and talking, even without a mask. I was at a dry cleaners today and it sounded like we both had socks against our mouths trying to tell each other what the order was. And I was sitting going, it just can't be this difficult. I agree with you. I think the challenge is, there's a balance. There's a perception that people want to go back to the way it was pre-COVID. Yeah, and I'm not saying that I don't think that it would ever return that way, but I do think that what COVID has done has allowed us to advance our digital ability to connect. It's really hard to start new relationships via a Zoom call, but we've managed to do it. And I do think that, from my perspective, I think the live event space is absolutely critical. The challenge with sponsorship is that sponsorship didn't actually turn off considerably during the pandemic. Most brands you would have seen, turned off traditional rights holder activity around live event space, and they moved it to things like purpose-driven, so food bags, supporting economies, small business, trying to really sort of leverage that purpose-driven approach. And I still think that has come through in weight and continues. But, the big catalyst is going to be, you've eventually got to immerse and come out of digital space. And, I was talking to a number of people who represent substantial financial brands in New Zealand, and the risk for them is that, sponsorship's about quite a rounded product. It's not easy. It's not like a media buy that's billable every month and you can just churn it over with no real storytelling connection. So you've got to muck in and really put some effort in. But when you do it right, it excels any other form because it's across your whole business. And so from my perspective, I think that the challenge that we're talking about is that people may lean towards digital and that focus might stay. And then what impact does that have then to what we just talked about? The immersive experience is great, but you want people on the ground, connecting, spending money in local economies, traveling, stopping over. But I do think, the thing that I've seen the biggest shift is that there's a lot of roles being advertised, that, there were disbanded sponsorship teams over the last sort of 2 years, particular airlines, hospitality, tourism. They're all now being re-advertised by the big players. They're starting to reposition themselves. Q4, I think, is really, really important going into 23. And there definitely is an appetite. Money's being spent. I think the key challenge for rights holders and events is going to be, the maturity. It shifted. It was easy. You could just put a deck together and present it. There's so much competition people are looking for they're looking for a fit, looking for value alignment. And I think a lot of brands are struggling with rights holders to even balance this whole purpose-driven discussion, because purpose, what is that?
Yeah, no, you've raised some very interesting points, especially around the digital side of events. I think certainly from a South African perspective, a lot of event organizers, event federations have been battling over the last 2 years, even on the digital platforms, because it's very difficult to raise the kind of revenue that you would raise if it's a physical type of event. But having said that, I mean, our research has shown us that, events has a way of helping economies to recover. And I'm particularly talking about destinations that depend on events to promote themselves as brands, as tourism brands, right? So we found that, for example, I'm sure you'll remember the 2008-9 global financial crisis. Our research showed us that whilst the world was going through a decline in foreign tourism arrivals, South Africa was one of the very few countries during that time, particularly in 2009, that experienced over 4% growth in foreign arrivals. And the reason for that was because you had a number of international events that happened in South Africa over that time. So, for example, you had the IPL cricket that was moved from India to South Africa because of the elections that were happening in India. That same year, you had the British and Irish Rugby Lions Tour. You had the Confed Cup. You had the ICC Champions Trophy. So a number of those events helped the South African economy to start, bouncing back from that crisis. Do you think the same argument can apply now with the pandemic? Do you think events is the answer to tourism economies globally?
Yeah, I think that with New Zealand in particular, the thing that interests me is that we're on a roll of major events at the moment. We've just had the Women's World Cup cricket. We've got obviously rugby coming, and then we've got the women's football, FIFA. In Australia, you've got the women's FIBA World Championships coming up as well. And I absolutely think that, especially being located in New Zealand, the bottom of the Southern Hemisphere, people are pining for global events. They want to see top level sport, willing to travel, and even the concert event series that's now opened back up. To your point, Sugen, it's not just sporting events, but Billy Joel running one concert in Melbourne, one concert in Auckland. I can tell you that those that missed out in Australia are all looking to come to New Zealand, and vice versa. I think people really want that connection. They want to reconnect with their artists, and there's an element of nostalgia in that. I don't know about you, but I think everyone got very tired of watching a webinar and just being spoken down to, and you can't meet. I think it's the key word for me in definition is it's the moment, it's the experience. Digital is great, advertising is great, but what's missing? Storytelling, connection. It's that human connection that you need. And that's what events do.
And you're right. I mean, when we talk about events, we're not just talking about sport events here. We're talking about events across the industry. So even your conferences, your exhibitions, your meetings are important catalysts for growing local economies. But just on that, Mike, I mean, globally, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, that small businesses are engines of many economies across the world, right? And certainly when it comes to the events industry, the sports industry, the supply chain of those sectors are made up primarily of small businesses. Now, I don't know about your experience, but certainly in South Africa, we've seen a lot of these small businesses actually closing down as a result of the pandemic. Some of them managed to survive, and now that the South African economy has opened up, we're seeing them come to life again. But what would your advice be to a small event organizer out there that's thinking, well, am I ever going to recover? How do I go about raising sponsors now in a changed kind of world? The world is different. What would your advice be to some of these small businesses out there?
Yeah, it's a really valid point you raised, Sugen, is that, I've found that there's been a significant shift. Those that have survived have actually probably repositioned themselves. So they might have been event industry people, and now they're actually doing some sort of retail, or they've moved into online services. And they've really just tried to sort of keep their head above water while this sort of moves through. New Zealand's actually just had, and it was postponed twice in the last 12 months, but we've just had the New Zealand Event Association's annual conference and gala awards, of which I judge, and you cannot underestimate the power of bringing the industry together, almost like a reopening celebration that you survived, you're here. And my response to those that are looking to seek funding, sponsorship, nothing's changed. Really, it's the basics. It's understanding your value proposition. Who is it that actually connects with your values? Brand matching, understanding who you need to connect with to have a conversation. The scale of the proposition, the rights fee, the money may increase between a global event and a local event. The reality is the principles are exactly the same. If you don't know your audience, you don't know what you're offering. And I would certainly say to those in the event industry, you've still got something to offer. You've got a great history. If you've survived it this long, keep going. Don't stop. And I think the thing that really resonated for me when we had that conference in Johannesburg is that the topic was about sport, tourism, and events. And sometimes I think industries and sectors try and survive in isolation. There needs to be a lot more co-creation, a lot more co-opetition, and you don't need to struggle on your own. There's a lot of benefit by working together.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you raised that, Mike. The conference that we had, was about, I think it was probably about 10 years ago. And it's ironic that you mentioned that, because as we speak, the Commonwealth Games are actually happening in Birmingham. And that conference, particularly that conference that you attended, was a platform for us to promote South Africa beyond the World Cup, because we just hosted a successful World Cup.
Yep.
And then we were saying, so what do we do as a country now? How do we actually sustain our interest in bringing international events into the country? And at that conference, we were actually pitching. We did a lot of research, and we did a lot of stakeholder engagements with the country to find out whether it's time for us to bid for a Commonwealth Games. And we put this great document together, the conference, and unfortunately, it never happened. Now obviously the cost factor was a big factor, for government at that time. I mean, I think it was about 4.6 billion rands, that South Africa had to spend. But the return on that investment was quite significant. I mean, we estimated it to be around close to 42 billion that the country would have leveraged from those games, right? Can you can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there is a growing debate that people are starting to think that Com Games and even Olympic Games probably have done their dash. That we're putting so much money. You think about Tokyo. I know we haven't seen the wash up yet, but you just imagine what the overrun of costs have been. And the amount of sponsors that also as brands have been affected because they've had to actually go from a budget cycle as planned to then another one, and they've stopped spending money because they're so focused. I think that Com Games is really important. You can see what it's doing in Birmingham. I'd love to see what it's going to do. I mean, the timing is great for them in terms of re-engaging community, especially Birmingham. You're right. I remember talking about the fact that there was a heightened excitement in South Africa about the pitch, and the fact that realistically it would have been on right now had that commitment stayed. And from my perspective, I just think that you've got to be in. You've got to get these events into your country. There's an expectation. Everyone pays taxes. We want to pine and travel, but you don't want people to travel. You want people to come and enjoy and visit. And these events create massive, not just immediate funds, but significant indirect benefit, relationships, contracts, deals. I've never seen, in actual fact, something that actually interests me, Sugen. I'd love to see what Birmingham does in the next sort of 5 to 10 years for Birmingham City. We always talk about legacy overlay with venues, but what about all these side deals and the industries and the businesses that will meet people they've not met before and then go on to something bigger and better purely by the introduction? I just think they're the things that sometimes fall behind the cracks in regards to how we assess things too.
Yeah, no, Mike. And I mean, I think you touched on some big issues there. You know, legacy issues are one of them. I mean, we've seen it through the World Cup, the Rugby World Cup in New Zealand, for example. I mean, you know, in South Africa, the FIFA World Cup. So, Mike, I mean, in terms of rounding up our conversation, what are your predictions for the future from a sponsorship perspective? And, you know, how do you think we should start positioning ourselves in order to benefit from the recovery of this pandemic?
Yeah, I think that, you know, brands are really trying to fight for space. They are generally interested in connecting. In actual fact, we just with Make-A-Wish New Zealand, we've just done a co-collaboration with Lay-By, who are the global buy now, pay later partners of Manchester United, who have just obviously come to Australia to play a 2-game series. I think before they were in Hong Kong, they played Melbourne Victory on a Friday night, and then they played Crystal Palace in Melbourne. And we're able to actually get a wish child from New Zealand and send them in a pandemic, which is unheard of, because it's unusual to send a very sick child, let alone a healthy child, to another country with all the risk. And so from our perspective, you know, media, football teams, a brand in Lay-By, even the mantra that they stayed in, decked out the bed in Manchester United colours, and they all got behind this because I think people are really wanting hope and joy. They want to create something that's exciting. And, you know, from my perspective, I just think that there are huge opportunities. People have got to continue to focus on what they're doing. Do you start moving from your hybrid or your online event and start moving back to live events? Do you have the technology to back that? What have you been doing? Even on a small scale, taking that to a partner or a brand and showing them how you've been resilient and fluid through the pandemic is actually a real strong quality. And from my perspective, you know, I think that there are significant categories, industries, technology, for example, that have thrived and boomed, including Zoom, right through the pandemic. And there have been traditional categories like tourism, hotels, airlines, the normal sort of C-suite stuff that most rights holders go to, that have had to reset, and they'll all come back. But you've just got to continue to understand what it is that you've got, how does it align, not just turn up with a deck and talk about the value proposition and why you think it is that brand, and ultimately work out who you need to speak to. People generally make a mistake, Sugen, that I'm going to speak to the CEO, I'm going to speak to the CMO, the head of brand, head of comms, head of marketing. The reality is, if you and I are running a TED Talk, there are no logos on a TED Talk. So we're certainly not going to have a conversation with the head of brand of DHL and trying to convince someone who lives and breathes by brand appearance that TED is going to be a great thing to invest in. However, the head of sales for DHL might be very interested in a TED Talk, because at the event, post the event, networking, they're in there immersing, they're talking, they're working through, they're cutting deals. And I think people have just got to be wise, think through what you've got, and be targeted. And at the end of the day, be authentic.
Yeah, no, Mike, thank you so much for your insights. It was really a pleasure having you on our BizHelp Changing the Conversation podcast. There you have it, folks. You've heard it. You know, there's some positive outlook about the future of the events industry. You heard it from an expert himself. So if you have any questions, or if you want to make any comments to either one of us, please feel free to follow us on all our social media platforms. We will be communicating quite soon some of our campaigns that we're going to be launching in order to assist people out there in terms of growing the events. We really need to grow the events industry. As I said earlier, events have a way of actually helping economies to revive themselves. So I think that as partners in the industry, we all need to come together. We all need to work together and really start building this industry, because it's an industry that's here to stay, as Mike said, and it's an industry that's resilient and can stand, pandemics and crises like we've experienced in the past. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, Mike.
Pleasure.